Okay, we did it. Thank you, everyone. This has been an exciting morning, afternoon on Salt Spring Island. So I'm joining you today from Salt Spring, the traditional territory of the Penelakut, Cowichan, and Wasanic nations. And this is a place that I know well. I grew up in the Salish Sea. And I'm going to talk to you about something dear to my heart today, shifting baselines in this region and the role of one of our most charismatic ungulates, black-tailed deer. So without further ado, this is me as a youngster, as a 2-year-old sitting behind our little cabin. I grew up in a 1-bedroom cabin on the shores of Trincomalee Channel, looking right across to the Cormorant Cliffs on Galiano, right where the ecological reserve is, and the wonderful facilities that have been put in place by the Conservancy there. So that was really my view growing up. And I think this growing up in this region really shaped, how I saw the world, and it certainly really, I think, was a motivating factor for me ending up in conservation, although I initially started out in medicine, but realized that I was much more passionate, I guess, about saving and protecting and understanding ecosystems and plants and animals. And so that's eventually where I ended up. So I'm now, I've lived all over the world, but I've come back to Canada, and a few years ago in 2018, I started up the Conservation Decisions Lab, and that was really a dream of mine, was to bring together and build a team which was really focused on understanding the cumulative impacts to these ecosystems, marine ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems, understanding and predicting the impacts of multiple stressors on these systems, but then importantly, using that information, those predictions, to transform that information into action. So into actions about what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, and when in time we're going to do it in order to achieve our conservation and restoration and natural resource management goals. So I've been really fortunate to land at the University of British Columbia, where I have a great team of graduate students, and we get to work on these really fascinating and globally important problems. So this is a landscape that makes me want to kind of fall to my knees and weep. This is a classic, historic Garry Oak meadow. It's probably a meadow system that many of you didn't even know existed in these islands, because it's certainly not what our meadows look like today. But there are places in the Salish Sea that do still look like that. And there are places where we're bringing back these ecosystems so they'll look like that in the future. And so today I want to walk through this idea of shifting baselines and restoration and conservation, and hopefully motivate you to think about how we can start to restore these systems, and so that we can have meadows like this on Galiano and Salt Spring and Pender and Maine, not just on some of these tiny little isolated islets. So this is the view from one of our study sites that we're working on quite a lot right now, Susquehanam. Susquehanam is the Senchothan name for this island. The English name was Halibut Island, and it's an island that I helped to protect earlier this year. One of the most astounding things about this island is that the flora is so incredibly rich, and it's like walking back in time. More often, the islands that we live on and work on look like this. And so these two pictures were taken one day apart. So just I want you to imagine, this is, in fact, they were taken about 2 weeks ago. And so when you can see, they're ecologically, they're vastly different. Both of them are beautiful, but they're very, very different. And so this brings us to this concept about shifting baselines. And shifting baselines is really this concept that Daniel Pauly talked about a couple of decades ago. And he stated, we alter the world, but we forget what it was like beforehand. And each subsequent generation regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal. So when we're young, we look at the world and we think that what we see has been that way for a really long time. When you're 5, that's the age of my son, everything to him feels normal. And when things change in our lifetimes, we regret what has changed. But for our own children born, say, 30 years later, into a more diminished world, what they see at 5 years old becomes their new normal. And so over time, we're constantly, what normal is constantly being redefined to mean less, to mean ecologically less. And that's what's been happening in the Salish Sea. And so the classic, when Daniel Pauly first kind of talked about this issue, he was really thinking about these marine systems. And Laura McClenachin, a colleague, she did this great series of images to kind of illustrate this point. And this is a jetty off Florida Keys. And this is an image taken in 1957 after a fishing charter. And you can, the size of these fish, these cod, are just phenomenal. They're larger than the people in this image. And everyone's smiling, delighted with their catch. And then we go forward just a year, still really big fish. Everyone has big smiles. A decade later, still some big fish, but not as many big fish, smaller fish, a few different species. Everyone's still looking pretty happy. And then fast forward another decade, 1978, starting to get some very different species in the mix now. Gone are those big, huge giants, but everyone still has a smile on their face. And then here we are, 1985, again, smaller fish, lots of them. And then this was the kind of Lauren's, last photo image. And she went out on a charter. And this was the catch that they caught when she came through. So, over 60 years, there's a huge shift ecologically in what's happened. And I'm going to talk you through a similar process to what's happening right now in the Salish Sea. So here we have wonderful Maitia Island in the San Juans. And this is a delightful island. It's this classic coastal Douglas fir and cedar ecosystem. And this island has no deer. So it's quite interesting. It has no people living on it, but also has no ungulates on it, no browsers. Then this is Wallis Island. This island has approximately about 0.2 deer per hectare. So the understory is starting to look a little bit different. And then here we contrast with Sydney Island, where there's about 1 deer per hectare. And the understory looks radically different. Here's another island that we have about 1 deer per hectare. This is Jones Island. And it's a very different looking ecosystem, still beautiful, but radically different. And when we think about how this, if we zone in on a really common shrub, so this is ocean spray, Holodiscus discolor. This is the architecture of this shrub when it doesn't have any browsing pressure. So no deer or elk browse, but predominantly we're talking about deer right now. This is on Little Darcy Island. So here we have around 0.2 deer per hectare. And then here's what ocean spray looks like on Sydney Island, where we have that 1 deer per hectare. And so there's a huge change in the architecture of this shrub. And that in turn is likely to influence a whole bunch of things that depend on that architecture. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. So we have these big changes happening in the ecosystem. And there's the main driver that I'm talking about right now is this deer browsing. So why are deer having this huge impact on these islands? Well, there's a few different reasons. And one is because we've eliminated the top predators. So we've eliminated wolves and we've eliminated cougars. And cougars and wolves and bears used to frequent and live on these islands permanently, or they would colonize an island. They would, predate on some deer, and they would swim to another island. And so they were really the top predator, which kept the black-tailed deer in a much, much lower abundance than what we find it in now. But we also had First Nations living in these islands. So First Nations, many different nations, were living across the Gulf Islands, and they had village sites on all of the main islands, and they were exerting their influence in stewardship on the island. So they were hunting ungulates, the cougar, deer and elk. And they were also doing a whole bunch of other things in this landscape, which turn out to be incredibly important for these incredible Garry Oak ecosystems, but also for the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. So one of the things that we're starting to really understand a lot more about is the influence of Coast Salish peoples in basically gardening these meadow Garry Oak landscapes. So Garry Oak ecosystems are these culturally, they're cultural ecosystems. They've really come about and been maintained through the actions of people. And this is just showing a couple of women harvesting camas. So camas, great camas and common camas were two of the most important food plants in this region. And this plant was traded, it was traded inland, it was traded north and south. And this bulb, the corm of this camas was pit roasted, and that roasting would convert all the sugars into these convert those carbohydrates into these sugars. And that was their main source of carbohydrate. And so this was an incredibly prized plant. And these meadows were essentially propagated and gardened and maintained down the matrilineal line. And they were as important as salmon fishing sites. And so there was practices that they used in particular to maintain these sites. And one of those was fire. So these regions, these islands experience low intensity fire quite regularly. And what we see now in the absence of that fire has been an encroachment of Douglas fir into these ecosystems. And so we have pressures coming from different angles. We have loss of top predators, hunting by First Nations, hunting by even settler communities. And that has that lack of hunting has resulted in an explosion of deer across our islands. And then at the same time, we also have this lack of fire. So we're getting this encroachment of Douglas fir into these meadow ecosystems. So colleagues and I have been writing about these topics for quite a long time, a couple of decades now, and I'm going to just walk you through some of the findings that we've been documenting as a result of these shifting baselines. So this is two of my team members in my lab, two of my graduate students, Kefra Beckett and Sophie McComb, and they're on Susquehanna, and they are counting flowering stems within these meadows. And I'll tell you why in a moment. So this is just some photos of the forest ecosystems going from no deer, less than 0.01 deer a hectare, right up into that high deer state. And then this is just a kind of a cartoon of the change in the architecture of that single shrub. And so what happens, we ask the question, so what is happening to the cover, to the richness of these particular shrubs? And what we wanted to also know was, were particular shrubs being targeted. So there's a bunch of shrubs which are culturally important. They're culturally important to First Nations for food and medicine, things like Nootka rose and Saskatoon berry and trailing blackberry. And so we had sites, we have sites across about 80 islands in this archipelago, and we measure the cover of these different shrubs. And we wanted to see whether these culturally significant food plants, how they fare in terms across these islands with different deer density. And so I'm going to show you a few graphs which look similar here. And essentially, I'm not sure if you can see, I can't get my cursor to work here. So what we're looking at on the x-axis, we have islands where deer are absent, right through to islands where we have a deer density of 0.9 to 2.8 deer per hectare. So very high densities. And what this is showing is that as soon as we hit this kind of point less than 0.08 deer per hectare, we're getting this big change. So well, the islands that have no deer, we have the highest native shrub cover, and we have the highest cover of culturally significant food plants. But as soon as we get to this 0.08 deer per hectare, this drops dramatically and it remains low. And so this is telling us that even at a density of 0.08 deer per hectare, so that's 8 deer per 100 hectares, that's still too high. So if we look at what the impact on shrub diversity, we see that similar decline once we go from no deer to having deer on these islands. And in this case, these culturally significant food plants, the diversity declined by around 54% in plots that had that 8 deer per 100 hectares. And then if we look at the richness of shrubs, so this is the number of different species of shrubs. We also, again, we see this decline from the no deer islands to even this, what we would consider a relatively low density of deer islands. So if we then start to think about, so that's thinking about the shrubs, what's happening to these forbs, these really important food plants and pollinator plants. And so here I'm drawing on some data from Emily Gonzalez and Peter Arcese, two of my colleagues. And Emily did this wonderful experiment where she had a treatment that was looking at the impact of deer herbivory as well as competition. So there's been some ideas that competition from exotic grasses, for example, may be a big driver of the decline in some of these important food plants, these things like Camas and sea blush. So what we have here on the first plot on the left, we have the number of stems of sea blush. And along the bottom, we have 3 years of data, 2003 to 2005. On the y-axis, we have the number of sea blush stems. And what this is telling us is H is for herbivory. So when we have an H plus, it means that these plants were being browsed. And if we have an H negative, it means that they were within an exclosure. And what this is telling us is that competition from grasses really doesn't have much to do at all with the density of stems. The density of sea blush stems is really driven by whether it's being browsed or not. Likewise, if we look at Camas, and we measure the mass of the Camas bulb, so this is this nutrient-rich bulb, we see that again, competition is relatively unimportant in modulating the size of the bulb. What's most important is whether that plant is getting browsed or not. And so once Emily enclosed these Camas and reduced the browse pressure from those Camas, the Camas mass, it basically went from between kind of 1 and 2 grams right up to between 4 and 5 grams. So quite a phenomenal change over a 3-year time period. So Camas bulb mass declines under browsing. And what that's really, that's important to know, because when we think about First Nations across the region are reasserting their rights and title and cultural practices, and they would like to reinstate, Camas harvest, but there's certainly no way that we'll be ever able to do that under our current level of browsing pressure. And even if we weren't trying to harvest Camas, there's a lot of other things that depend on these incredibly rich resources. So this is just I wanted to show this in Nancy Turner's work. She estimated that, that Coast Salish First Nations were harvesting around 400 bulbs an hour, around between 36 and 40 kilograms of Camas bulbs a day. And that translates to between 1 and 2.3 million bulbs for every 1,000 people. So that's a lot of Camas. I mean, it really kind of boggles my mind to imagine how extensive Camas must have been across this region for people to harvest that much of it sustainably. So this is a quote from James Swan, who is a 19th century ethnographer and naturalist. And he writes, "I never have met with a white person who is not fond of a baked Camas, and I do not know any vegetable except fried bananas so delicious." So I look forward to a day that I can go and harvest Camas with my kids and enjoy this delicacy. So of course, when our understory in our vegetation communities change, so does everything else that depend on those communities. And so this is almost about close to 15 years ago now, I was working in Australia and I came back to Canada, and I undertook a postdoc with Peter Arcese to understand whether this change in browsing, browsing pressure was also influencing bird communities that depend on this understory vegetation in particular. And so we set up some a priori hypotheses. And we suspected that, these bird species, these songbirds that depended on in the canopy would probably be not so impacted by deer browsing, whereas the species that really depended on the understory and on the ground for foraging and nesting would be most impacted. And so then I went out to test those predictions. And that's generally what I found, was that species like rufous hummingbird, orange crown warbler, song sparrow, fox sparrow were being hugely impacted by deer browsing. And so in this graph, we have the species, these 5 species along the bottom. Then we have LMH, that's low browsing. So those are islands that have basically no deer on them. Moderate browsing, so that's the islands like Wallis, where we have around 0.2 deer per hectare, up to this high browse level like Sydney and Darcy and Jones Island, where we have around 1 deer per hectare. And this is just illustrating that, as that browsing pressure increases, we're getting a loss in the relative abundance of these iconic bird species. So we're transforming our ecosystems. We have these incredible meadows, and they've been converted into essentially these ecological deserts that people flock all around the world to come and see because they're still beautiful. But for me, when I think about what these places looked like when I was a little girl, and it's heartbreaking. I want to see these meadows back. I want to be able to walk through these meadows with my grandchildren. I want generations to come to be able to harvest, these meadows for food plants. One of the projects that we've been working on this season with my master's student, Kefra Beckett, is understanding how this loss of floral resources in understory impacts bumblebees. And so this is Bombus vosnescus, and it's one of our largest bumblebees, and it's feeding here on one of my favorite plants. This is Lamatium nauticale, or Indian celery, and then we have a red paintbrush in the image as well. And so Kefra has been basically surveying bumblebees across the islands and measuring the diversity and the richness and the abundance of bumblebees across these islands with different densities of deer on them. And this, where she's sitting right now in one of our, back on Susquehanna, Halibut Island, in this glorious meadow of fawn lilies. So this is, we've gone from, we have these historic baselines. We have some of these small islands left in the Salish Sea that gives us a glimpse of what big islands like Galiano and Salt Spring used to look like. And I guess, the question is, can we get some of this, can we go back? Can we get some of these ecosystems back? And the exciting thing is that we know restoration is possible. So this is an exclosure after 15 years on Sydney Island, tiny little exclosure that parks put up. And it was all self-colonized, and it's impenetrable. When we look at our meadows, this is one of the beautiful Garry Oak Meadow on Salt Spring Island, looking over Sampson Narrows. This is an exclosure that Parks put in place a few years ago. This has been in place about 10 years now. And when you walk inside the exclosure, this is what you see. You start to see these native delphiniums and camas. And so that's exciting. That's exciting that there's actually even a seed and bulb resource still in the soil after almost a century of intense browse pressure on these ecosystems. In other cases, just putting up a fence or removing deer may not be enough. We may need to do much more active measures of bringing back in seed and propagules into these sites. One of the most exciting sites that I've been working on with colleagues in the US is on Yellow Island, and this is standing in one of the most glorious meadows we have in the Salish Sea, and with Peter Dunwitty and a couple of my other colleagues. And this place is really just kind of jaw-droppingly gorgeous. It's if you haven't been there, and when the borders open up, make a plan to go and see this island. They accept visitors. The island is stewarded by the Nature Conservancy. You can Google Yellow Island and put that on your calendar to make an appointment to go and see this place in the spring. But this island, it didn't always look like this. And when we first started working on it almost 20 years ago, it was covered in Douglas fir. And so one of the first things that we did was actually cut out a lot of the Douglas fir. So there's still some trees on the island, but we opened the meadow back up, and we've been using fire across this island. It's divided up into fire zones, and we've been putting back low intensity fire into this ecosystem. So this is just camas and red paintbrush, and you can see there's a bit of death camas in there, and just glorious. The lamatium and western buttercup, more of that lamatium. It's really extraordinary. So now that we're all of our islands have been heavily modified, and we're thinking about, so what can we do? Parks, Gulf Island National Parks asked my colleagues and I to help them develop a deer management plan for the Gulf Island Park Reserve. And so that got us thinking about, well, what are our management options? And this is just, I'm going to just show you sort of some preliminary things that we've been working on right now. And so here's a list of potential alternative things that we can do, or things that we're considering within the park reserve in particular. And so one is around reinstating a First Nations harvest, so facilitating nations to come and harvest deer. Another one is more targeted hunting. So this is really kind of getting sharpshooters in to try to really knock the population of deer down, so that it could then be maintained at a reasonable level. Another action is around improving predator viability. And so that's really about educating communities around, if a cougar or a wolf happens to swim onto Galiano Island, let's allow it to stay instead of shooting it. In Salt Spring, cougars don't last very long here, and that's it's a tragedy, because they're doing a lot of really good work for us by predating on deer. We looked at some options of cougar introduction, wolf introduction, bear introduction, just to try to see, what would the potential benefit and feasibility be of reintroducing predators into these systems. We looked at birth control and sterilization. And then we looked at some combinations of action. So what if we had a First Nations harvest, but we also simulated the presence of predators? Thinking about this, there's this theory about this ecology of fear. So when animals are under pressure of predation, there's a fear response, and that reduces the reproductive success and the reproductive capacity. And so maybe we could just simulate that somehow. Rather than having predators in the systems, we could just kind of scare the crap out of deer now and then have some hunting, and that might kind of reduce their reproductive output. We had a combination of First Nation harvest and then that more targeted hunting, and then another one around improved predator viability and predator introduction. And then we examined kind of all of those strategies together, what would be the benefit. So one of the things that my team has been developing are these quantitative tools for trying to assess what is the efficacy of different management strategies. And so we applied a technique called priority threat management, where we're using essentially a cost effectiveness analysis. So we're estimating the benefit of each of these strategies. So this is the benefit with respect to the probability of having a thriving, self-sustaining Garry Oak ecosystem that, like in those beautiful photos that I showed you earlier. And then we also estimated the kind of relative cost of these different strategies over 10 years. We estimated the feasibility, so the social, political feasibility and the technical feasibility of each of those strategies. And then together, we can essentially use a very simple formula where we multiply the benefit of an action by the feasibility and divide it by the cost. And that gives us a cost effectiveness score. And so from there, we can start to look at what are some of these kind of most cost-effective strategies. And in this analysis, kind of 5 things seem to come up, and they're really around improving that predator viability. So really educating our community so that we can learn to live with predators, having some targeted hunting, but also having First Nations harvest, and even better, having those things happening hand in hand. So where to now? We want to, we really want to get more ecosystems like the image on the left, and move away from this kind of ecosystems that are quite denuded and don't really serve any of the other species that share these islands with us. So I'll just going to show you a few more glorious photos of these wonderful meadows and then wrap up. So what have we learned? The loss of top predators and the loss of First Nation stewardship has led to this cascading impacts and is contributing to shifting baselines and to what we perceive as normal. We know that overbrowsing by deer leads to the loss of wildflowers. It leads to completely altered shrub architecture and richness and diversity. And it leads to long-term changes in forest structure. So one thing that I didn't mention was that deer like browsing tree seedlings. They really like, in particular, deciduous trees like the Garry oak, like arbutus. And many of those arbutus and Garry oak that we see today, they are the living dead because there are no new young trees coming up behind them. So in the long term, if we don't start to think about this important issue, we are going to have very different looking forests in the future. We've documented significant changes in songbird communities, and now we're looking at the bumblebee communities. And what we estimate from all of this is that probably historically, deer densities were unlikely to ever have been greater than around 1 deer per 100 hectares. So that's very different from where we are. In fact, on some islands, that's a tenfold difference. And so we have a long way to go to get back to anything like that. And there's a bunch of different options that we can look at to get there. But certainly, you know, on these big islands, we can put up big fences. That is an option. You know, it's an expensive option, but it's an option. But we can also think about educating our community around why it's important to reinstate, you know, a top predator, which is essentially us in this system, for the benefit of these ecosystems and the species that rely on them, and also for the benefit of the deer themselves, because our deer are suffering from disease, from high parasite loads, and from various viruses, and that is all to do with hyperabundance. So restoration is possible. We have these incredible baselines out there, some of these small islands that still are really like walking back in time. They're rare and they must absolutely be protected. And we know that we can restore these degraded meadows, but it's going to include understanding more about the First Nations that lived in these islands for millennia, welcoming them back into these islands to practice their stewardship practices and to learn from those stewardship practices. It's going to entail some type of management of black-tailed deer. It's going to also maybe entail, if we can, to bring back some low intensity burning and some girdling of firs. If we can't burn to keep the firs out, then maybe we need to start girdling. Propagation and seeding, certainly eradication of fallow deer. I haven't even touched on fallow deer. I've really been talking about black-tailed deer. Management of Canada goose, that's a whole nother talk. Invasive species management and an enormous community engagement. One of the things that we're discussing a lot here on Salt Spring is around climate adaptation. And there's a link between deer, hyperabundance, and fire risk. And so we're putting out soil moisture meters across these islands. And what we see is that islands that are heavily browsed, that soil profile is drying out much quicker than islands that have a thick understory. And that dry soil profile increases our fire risk. And so this is a big issue ecologically, and it's also a big issue moving forward as we think about climate adaptation and reducing fire risk. So I'm gonna leave it there, and hopefully we have a few moments for questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Tara. That was very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, Jessie.
Hi, Virginia.
Yeah, I just put a question in the chat, and just remembering that Galiano last year had a die-off of deer due to disease. And I just wondered if this is a natural form of deer control and therefore good, but does that kind of thing actually have negative effects on the ecosystem as well? Because disease doesn't sound good, but so I just wondered about that.
Yeah, so we did have the presence, and there is a virus that is circulating in the population. It didn't result in a huge die-off. Our estimates suggest that deer densities are as high as they've ever been. And we expect to see more I guess, diseases in the deer population, because naturally they would never have been at these high densities. They're 100 times, 10 times what they were probably historically. And so that's just, it's not a good thing for the deer. And that historically, you can imagine that deers they're great swimmers. They swim around between these islands. Their population might build up. Then, a cougar or wolves would swim over. They would hang out for a few months, knock that population down. And then those plants would have a period of time where they weren't being browsed. So they'd have a period of time that they could grow and set seed, and things could rebound. Whereas now there's no break. It's relentless. There's no time. We've seen with that sea blush, my colleague Peter Arcese has shown that there's been a genetic shift. There's been a selection for a dwarf gene, so that sea blush on islands that have a lot of deer, they only grow, about 4 inches high, and they flower. And that's because over time, from browsing, this dwarf gene has been selected for. And so that's a big influence. Luckily, it's an annual, and it can adapt, but for perennials, they're not able to adapt that quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. I didn't realize that. I thought sea blush was just always that small. That's what I'm used to from kayaking, is I guess the stunted ones.
That's right. When you go
Suzanne,
into these other islands, you're knee deep in them.
Wow.
They're all over. Yeah, it's amazing.
Incredible. Suzanne Fournier has her hand up.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was just a fascinating talk. I've heard Peter Arcese speak actually to the GCA, but I felt you really went into the whole subject in more depth. As you may know, the Galiano Conservancy is engaged in a deer harvest program with First Nations. My question specifically relates to Susquehanna. Do you think that a kind of co-management program between conservation groups and First Nations is important? And do you see that as becoming more common in the future?
Indeed, Suzanne, I think this is one of the most important things that we can be doing as conservation organizations, is really thinking about how to learn, with our First Nation partners, how to welcome them back onto these islands, because they've largely been alienated from these islands for a very long time. And even, one of the things that we're thinking about in the Salt Spring Conservancy is giving land back. Should we even be holding, can we start to divest ourselves of some properties and hand them back to nations and co-manage them with nations? Susquehanna is really, it's an incredible island that, I used to go past with my parents when we were fishing as a kid, and I'd look out and just think, wow, that island's, you could see the colors from the shore. So you knew it was just glorious. And then I had some study sites on that island when Hilton Burry, who was the previous owner, he had it for 40 years. And then when he passed away, I quickly contacted the realtor and said, can I come onto the island and do a full kind of floristic survey? And it was everything I expected and more. And so that island I was fortunate that I actually was able to find a donor that put up the money, and donated the money to the Land Conservancy to purchase the island, but on the condition that that island eventually be handed back to the WSÁNEĆ peoples.
So just to follow up, so the donor was fully cooperative with the concept of returning the land to the WSÁNEĆ, or a co-management role.
Yeah.
Do you think that that is a spur to private donation, the concept? I mean, everyone is interested in reconciliation, but could it be actually a spur or encouragement for donation?
Absolutely. I think it's really the way we need to be thinking in conservation, because conservation has been a very colonial exercise. It's been around, purchasing land and locking people out, and has, I think it's evolving, and part of that evolving is starting to acknowledge that these systems they only existed because they were managed by people in a certain way. And so I think and it's about reconciliation. It's also about basic ecological restoration to really start to bring people back into these ecosystems. And so I think that's a very exciting prospect, and I'm really excited about the program that you have in the Galiano Conservancy of working with Penelakut to bring hunters onto the island, and we're looking at kind of mimicking something very similar here on Salt Spring, based on the work that you've done to welcome the nations back onto the Conservancy lands to hunt deer.
Well, thank you so much. And I think with respect to the hunting, due credit is due to Adam Huggins and the Charlie family and some other Galiano Islanders. But thank you so much. That was a really great talk.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, Susan.
Yeah, I have a question,
Susan.
if I could. Thank you, Tara. Just gorgeous. I love your imagery and the passion that you speak about. It's just very, very moving. I have a couple of quick questions. One, the whole idea of reintroducing predators, has that been done successfully with community acceptance anywhere that you know of?
It hasn't been done in our region yet, but there are certainly there are many regions in the U.S., particularly in parks where they've been reintroducing predators, and in Africa as well. They've had programs, for example, where they've reintroduced predators, and the predators might have a collar. And then people have an app on their phone, and they can see exactly where that predator is at any time. And so there's some really interesting kind of techie ways that you can bring predators into the system, but the community can be aware of, where that predator might be at any one time.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And then my second question is about Douglas fir. I'm not quite sure what girdling is, but I'm wondering now, is it better not to encourage Douglas fir seedlings if part of your property is a part of a meadow system?
Absolutely. So, if I think this is a really important point, is that we need to, in order to maintain these ecosystems, these Garry Oak meadow ecosystems, we need to not allow the Douglas fir to move in. And so that means getting at girdling is essentially where you're taking the bark and a ring of bark and cambium off of the tree. So you're basically ring barking the fir. And then it just dies at kind of a slow death and turns into good wildlife habitat for things that like to feed on these dead and dying trees. And so, yeah, managing your regrowth in terms of Douglas fir is really important. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about, reducing the deer browse. So those things have to go hand in hand.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl and Tara. And Pearl, we do have an ongoing girdling program on our Mount Sudal property, we've girdled some trees and we have plans to girdle others, more for the benefit of the Gary Oaks up there than the meadows, because we're not doing anything about the browsing apart from an exposure. But yeah, it works quite well, and it's something we'll continue to do in those ecosystems. I think Susan DeBeck has a question.
Yes, thanks. I've actually realized now I've got two questions, but the first was just in terms of the deer, you know, what progress has been made in terms of the deer, I mean, of the First Nations hunting the deer. Suzanne, you just were explaining that there is a program. I haven't been aware of, you know, how much, quite honestly, how much volume has gone down as a result, because it certainly seems like I've got plenty of deer still on my property.
Well, I can field that question. So,
Okay.
Susan, what we've done is that we've made the Millard Learning Center accessible for First Nation hunters in controlled hunts that are pre-planned with the property closed for the safety of the public beforehand. And it's been popular with our partners on Penelakut, and it's been the means by which we've had the deer to host Feed the People workshops, which have happened the last 2 falls. We actually have organized 3, but it could only host 2. One had to be canceled because of COVID-19 restrictions that's changed abruptly. And we plan to do it again this fall. So it remains to be seen whether it's having an impact at the MLC, the Millard Learning Center, in terms of keeping deer populations down. And probably it's having negligible impact anywhere else on the island because it is a very low level of hunting. But it's the start of recognizing that is necessary. So hopefully there will be more community of acceptance of that kind of ungulate control in the future. One
Great.
question I have for you, Tara, that's
Actually,
kind of related.
sorry, I did have another question, if you don't just mind me sneaking
Please,
it
go
in.
ahead, Susan.
It's got to do with determining whether you have a real meadow or not. I mean, I have a cleared area on my property, and it's like, has it been deforested or has it been a meadow? Is there any way, Tara, of telling whether a meadow is a meadow or whether a meadow is a cleared deforested area?
That's a great question. So there are, and you know, we can do soil plugs to kind of look at the soil profile and look at what's called a phytolith analysis to see what type of these kind of plants break down and they leave silica, and those plant parts are associated with different species. And so we can look through the profile and we can say, oh, this is a Doug forest today, but you know, 200 years ago, this was a meadow, or vice versa. That's a lot of work. Just looking at probably where the location of your property, the aspect of your property, and what is the current species composition of your meadow. You know, if you have any of these kind of Gary Oak characteristic plants, that is a clue that perhaps that was a meadow previously. And I think it's important to remember that meadows didn't just occur on these shallow soil sites, which is where we normally find them now, but they occurred on deep soil sites, and those deep soil sites were kept open by this burning. And so there's no quick and easy way. Doing a bit of a walk over your land and looking at what the species composition is now, and just understanding more about where it's situated, in terms of its aspect and slope is a good start.
So what in particular, is there any species in particular that would be indicators of that?
Well, any some native grasses, things like festuca, any of the festucas or the Danthonia. If you've got, Camas or the Brodea, any the fool's onions, any of the lomatiums, those are all signs that would have been a meadow previously, a culturally modified meadow.
Okay, so not things like thimbleberry or salmonberry is not in the...
No, those are more, thimbleberry and salmonberry, they actually kind of like more disturbed areas, forest edge areas. Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
And I think Tom is next in terms of our questions. You're still muted, Tom. You're still muted, Tom.
Too many buttons to push. Sorry. I have a quick question about the soils. Did you look at soil carbon? Because if you have drying wet cycles, you're probably putting out more methane and losing a lot of soil carbon. Is there any real data on that, or?
Not yet. That's something that we really want to look at is what's happening, below ground in terms of the soil carbon, but also in terms of the meso and macrofauna within the soil itself. So yeah, that's something that's on the on the wish list. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Tara? I actually have one that follows up on, I think Eric Higgs just unmuted himself.
Yeah,
Eric,
I can just, well, I put something in the chat and I just wanted to say hi, Tara. Good to see you. Thanks for a great presentation. I just wanted to let you know you'll be gratified that we're moving ahead the week after next with students to resurvey some ocean spray transects at the Millard Learning Center. And we don't know whether we'll see an effect, but Adam and I are hoping that we'll see an effect from the hunting activities recently. So anyway, stay tuned.
Wonderful. Great.
Nice to see you.
If anyone else has questions, please do raise your hand or unmute yourself. But in the interim, I had one question, Tara, that kind of feeds off of what Susan was asking about the effect of hunting pressure at the MLC. Speaking with some of the hunters that came over, my understanding is there are few and very few deer on Penelakut Island. I'm wondering if anyone has looked at the effect that has had, whether Penelakut's been a study site for recovery of meadows.
Yeah, so I no, but we haven't actually put any study sites specifically on Penelakut Island, but we have had some sites on Tent Island, which is at right next door. It is still pretty heavily impacted by deer, but when you walk through Penelakut Island, we were there just before the COVID outbreak, meeting with elders, and they have they have a substantive understory. We just don't have that. And so there's that would be great to measure, because that's a sizable island where the deer density has been kept much lower. But I would really like to go in and look at those meadows and just to see what's going on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, for those that don't know, Tent Island is a small island south of Penelakut Island that doesn't have residents, but does have high recreational use. So there's probably a lot of trampling of any meadows that are trying to recover there. Are there any other questions in the group? Suzanne Fournier raised a hand. Is that another question, Suzanne?
Yes, I was going to ask, is it possible to visit Susquehanam, or would it be possible for, when things return more to quotes normal, for the Conservancy to have a group visit the island? And do we need to obtain permission of the WSUNC as well?
Yeah, so we're just working on the protocol right now for visits. Things have been slow because of COVID, and we haven't even gotten all the elders out there yet. And so we're quite a long way away from being able to kind of say what the ultimate protocol will look like. But at this stage, for the near term, the island is closed. It's not open to the public, and it's only open to the WSUNC at this stage. Once those nations have been able to visit the island, and once we have the management plan in place, then I do see that there's going to be a role that island will play in terms of education. And that's when, we could work to have some a conservancy visit, for example, under kind of an educational activity. But the island won't be open just for the public to show up. It'll only be under kind of these special guided activities, because not only ecologically this place is incredibly important, but also culturally there's a lot of very important cultural features on the island that are very important for the WSÁNEĆ people.
So in that case, just a quick follow-up. The co-management by the WSÁNEĆ is absolutely key here, because I'm sure you're familiar with Dionisio on Galiano. The Penelakut have very strongly expressed their desire that if there not be public access, at least it be controlled and curtailed. They don't want a road into the site, and that's always an issue with conservation areas because people press for access. So just in the Penelakut situation, they are basically in the position of asking BC Parks to take more of a custodial and stewardship role. And in your experiences, BC Parks or other groups amenable to that kind of shared co-management?
I think BC Parks is on a really steep learning curve right now. And, we're working with them on Salt Spring at a place called Kwakwa, which is also known as Burgoyne Bay Provincial Park. And the Cowichan are reasserting their rights and title on that area. And it's, I think it's been pretty uncomfortable for parks, but they've got some good people there that are starting to really kind of acknowledge, oh, this is actually really happening, and we need to help facilitate this as best we can. So the kind of the mantra and the actual on-ground action within parks has not been kind of hand in hand, but I think there's slowly they're starting to realize that this is the future, and so this is, but I think it's still very early days for them figuring out how they do this in a good way.
Thanks very much.
Any other questions, folks? All right. Well, thank you so much, Tara, for joining us. It was a wonderful presentation, and you're leading the way on so many different fronts here in the Salish Sea. So I am myself sitting on a mountain of questions, a small mountain of questions that I have for you. And I'll get in touch at another date to talk about them. But thanks again.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Really wonderful to join you. And thanks for your patience with my tech issues over here. Have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you for overcoming that power outage. That was impressive.